Central Asia program and the associate director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at GW. And it's my great pleasure and honor to receive you this afternoon for a very important, I think, and very timely discussion on the US-Uzbek relations. It was really a landmark week for the bilateral relation last week, and I think that's very important. There have been already several events organized in DC, but we thought it was really making sense to have one more after the presidential visit to kind of discuss the results of this several meetings and kind of discuss the future of Uzbekistan foreign policy in general and of the US-Uzbek relationship. So it was really a landmark week that was important both for the US to kind of show or renew its commitment to Central Asia. It was already done a few months ago during the visit of the Kazakhstani president Nursultan Nazarbayev here in DC, and it was reconfirmed last week with the visit of the Uzbek president Shavkat Mirziyoyev here in DC. And it's also very important for Uzbekistan to get kind of recognition of the new political course that have been launching 1.5 years ago, and there is probably nothing better in terms of visibility of having this recognition done in Washington, DC. So to discuss this kind of bilateral perspective, we have, I hope, I'm sure, a very good panel with several people. I will first give the floor to our guest from the State Department, Mr. Scott Reid, who will be giving a kind of summary of the US perspective and the State Department's perspective on the presidential visit. Then I propose to have some question, and then we will open the floor for a roundtable with Paul Stronski from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Navbahor Imamova from Voice of America, and I will be giving some comments. And then I would like, after that, to give the floor and very much welcome Mr. Javlon Vakhabov, the ambassador of Uzbekistan, who made the great pleasure of being with us today and who will be also giving some comments on the Uzbek perspective. So as you will see, it will be a very rich discussion. So as I told you, our opening speaker, Mr. Reid, is the current office director for Central Asia at the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. He's a former US Navy officer who was director of the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement in Kabul for several years, also in charge of regulating conventional arms export there, working especially on the Indian export control regime accession. Before that, he was a deputy permanent representative for the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. He also served as both deputy and then acting political military section chief in Baghdad at the end of the 2009-2010, serving as the lead civilian drawdown planner for the withdrawal of the US land force there. He was also, before that, acting deputy chief of mission and political advisor to US NATO in the second half of the 2000s. So really a great experience on the broad Central Asian region. So Mr. Reid, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and I invite you to take the floor.
Merci, Marlene. And a pleasure to see Ambassador Vakhabov here. It's a pleasure to see so many friendly faces here. This is quite a great crowd here. And I'm going to lead off with the really dry remarks that'll set the conversation and give us the basis. But I really look for Peter. A pleasure to see you. I look forward to the Q&A part and the back and forth, the dynamic discussion, because I think that's what will probably uncover all the many different perspectives on this. Really is what a historic visit. First off, I want to give a tribute to the program here, because this is a program that's really been growing. It's fantastic. It's laser focused in on Central Asia. It gives us wonderful insights into the region, opportunities to get together with many different stakeholders in the region's relations with the West, and we really appreciate the partnership. Thank you very much. You guys are doing great things. And last recruiting speech for the State Department. I hope some of you will someday take the Foreign Service test or come over to the Civil Service, and we'd love to see you in our ranks and someday on this side of the podium. So we hope to see the future with these faces out here today. Now we really, it was an incredibly dynamic visit last week. As Marlene said, we also had the privilege of seeing Kazakhstan's president here not long ago as well. And Central Asia is very prominent in the administration's thinking and how to relate to Eurasia. And we've just been absolutely very, very pleased and privileged to have this highest level meeting here in the last 4.5 months. I would say it was historic in several different ways, in its scope, in the energy, and also the potential it represents to take forward dramatically different relations for the United States, and I would say even for the West, with the Central Asian region going forward. We laid the groundwork for many things last week. I would say we planted many seeds. It was the broadest strategic relationship that we mapped out a foundation for, and we look forward in having many follow-up meetings. Some of them started earlier today about how we're going to follow up from lots of the very well-meaning words and documents that were signed that we're going to put into practice absolutely as soon as we can. When we think about Central Asia, if we drop back for a second, in our perspective, we're talking about a region that in and of itself has tremendous potential. It is one that also shares a lot of challenges that other important parts of the regions, pivotal regions in the world share, and it faces some threats as well. And when we thought about how we wanted to look at the Kazakh and Uzbek visits this year in 2018, we talked about having to have very new, broad-based relationships with the entire breadth of the two governments that we're dealing with. It wouldn't be enough to kind of pick an aspect of a relationship and try and hinge what we were aiming or targeting to do with them on the kind of narrow part of it. We needed to engage at the highest levels and across the entire length and breadth of the government, and I think that we've done that with these two visits, particularly with the one that we just concluded. The region also is vital, and it's, I would say, strategic, borderline on pivotal. It's one of those because of the familiar Silk Road metaphors, but east, west, north, south. But I think it's pivotal for another reason. It's pivotal because of the dramatic explosion of its youthful population. It is got one country that's coming into the middle of the OECD index. It's got another that has the potential to verge onto it. And it has linkage potentials to show how that growth can be both a model for others around it to follow, but also to show that there aren't zero-sum choices that the societies in the middle of Eurasia have to choose one way or the other, north, south, east, or west. They can make their own choices and map their own futures. And that is a message that we very much want to underscore. It's part of our message on continuing to support their sovereignty, territorial integrity, and their independence. Now I'm going to do something that may sound strange because I'm not going to talk about Uzbekistan for a second. I'm not going to talk about Kazakhstan either. I'm going to talk about some recent visits we've had in Dushanbe and Bishkek. And if you'll bear with me for a second, there's a little bit of a reason for this. It's part of the long play for the region and experiences we've had there with some focus teams and why it's underpinned the approaches we're taking in these recent high-level visits. When we were recently in Dushanbe and talking with authorities there, both Tajik authorities and a large number of regional players that were there for, it was part UN, part Tajik-hosted Conference on Counterterrorism and Transnational Threats, we were struck by you relearning important lessons. If you get together, like some of you have probably been to counterterrorism expert meetings, you often hear them talking about very tactical things, talking about their quick wins, how they're going to get the latest theory in counterinsurgency or counterterrorism brought up to scale or something like that. That wasn't really our takeaway after 2 days of meetings there. Our takeaway is that the most valuable things that we were doing, we were instead doing nowhere near the Ministry of Interior halls or the security services halls. It was the things we were doing out in the American corners. It was the things we were doing out with the Ministry of Education, with some local police that we went down and visited where we'd help them repair a police station about a couple of kilometers from the border. And it was talking about basic basically with middle grade school teachers that we engaged in that trip in 2 different sub-regions, one in the Far East and one in the southern part of Tajikistan. And it was about helping ourselves hear the messages about what their students were encountering, what their colleagues were encountering, about the types of messages that could someday lead to radicalism. But they're really about choices that they feel like in their society they're having to face. And they're yearning to look for alternative points of view, different information outlets. They're basic yearning to participate in critical information and critical decision making and thinking. And we had I think a very important meeting when we came back from it. Then rather than Ambassador Hoagland's probably sat in some of these meetings after you come back, are we going to put X .2 million more dollars? And I know Paul's probably going, I don't want to talk to the Hill about this. This is on the record, but kind of only an aside. We had, I think, a more meaningful discussion, which was if we're really going to be in a discussion where we want to help these governments, these societies ward off the transnational threats, there are real significant lures and challenges to their public governance models. Where do we want to be? Do we want to be out in the streets? Do we want to be out with educators? Do we want to be out with local police dealing with local problems? Or do we want to be more in the halls of trying to find the latest thing that looks like an NCIS sort of scenario or something like that? And we've made a decision that we want to be more out on the streets with the educators, and we want to be in those kind of, you could call them long play, but we want to be in more civil society, person-to-person engagements. And, okay, so that was my foray elsewhere in the region, but to explain to you why, taking this back, the meetings with Kazakhstan and particularly with Uzbekistan recently were so important to us. Some of the most meaningful things, and we had a wonderfully very dense joint statement, it's full of all sorts of really meaty things we're going to work together. But I think some of the most meaningful things we did were in the the memorandums of understanding that we're going to put together with them on working in the universities to put in American corners, adding a significant number of Fulbrights to help at different levels of education and help bring teaching methods and critical thinking methods into the full Ministry of Education web, if you will. Bring in a lot more Cochrane Fellows, our Department of Agriculture experts and academics to help with everything from soil conservation to animal livestock husbandry, to help with real export models, capital structures that we're going to help them bring in via AID to help real farmers be able to do real export in short-term times of the goods and services and the wonders of the Uzbek farm that anyone who's been in the region for 5 minutes can see, but help put it actually on the market. And to spend a lot more of our time there than on what the other alluring other in the region would always be great gamery or something like that. There have probably been stories, there might be speculation among some of you, where there outside the joint statement, great gamery sort of things. And frankly, I hate to disappoint you, but really no. we were going in a different direction, and the discussions we had with President Mirziyoyev and with his huge team that he brought, and this was another wonder of the visit, and it's credit to the ambassador and all of his team that they were able to put the platform together to host so many senior Uzbeks. We really had everyone who was anyone in the government that was interested in really rolling up their sleeves and getting down to business with us for 2.5 days, and they were all over the cabinet agencies of Washington and up on the Hill as well. They darkened quite a few doors, and people all over Washington they had an Uzbek in their face. And there with purpose to talk about a specific thing and something measurable to get done in the next year or 2 years. And the spirit of partnership was really very, very impressive, and the town took notice. Now, I want to zero in on a couple of specific things that I think maybe they're from the joint statement, but there may be things that maybe the ambassador would like to remark on later that, in addition to the people-to-people contacts, we tried to focus on. Again, because they had strategic meaning to help Uzbekistan go to the next level in trade or outreach in the region, but also specific things we could do to help Uzbekistan get there, or it could do with those in the region to help get to the next level. On economic threads. We had a lot of good meetings. I know you guys had meetings I'd like to hear more about with World Bank as well, but we talked a lot with USTR and with Treasury on helping get beyond the very commendable first stage of the currency liberalization to start working on IPR and the specific IPR accords that WIPO is going to demand of Uzbekistan to make an earlier than what would otherwise be the case move towards WTO accession. But we talked in very concrete terms about real regulatory steps that we're going to have to, not just laws to be passed, but regulatory steps to be measured, and how WIPO is going to be in country and exactly how they're going to do the scorecard. And we lined up AID assistance to help with very specific movements along that path. We talked about having our trade and investment forum in Tashkent. It's normally up in Kazakhstan, off in Almaty. It'll be down in Tashkent this year. We talked about Central Asia Trade Forum, we're going to have a larger amount of pairing expeditions and set that up in Tashkent this year for the region. AID just completed a very, very large business-to-business pairing expedition to the Baltics. We've had about the first few days $6 million in contracts, and probably about another 16 to 18 million coming out of it before it's finished. And we'll be ready for some reverse trade missions later in the year as well. It wasn't an accident. Secretary Ross was the lead American at probably Washington's biggest ticket last week was the Uzbek Gala at the Willard. It was pretty amazing. You guys really, I think you wowed the city, and you also showed two things: that Uzbek hospitality is legend for a good reason, and you also showed that it is a very welcoming, it is very hospitable, it is a very embracing, outward-facing society. And the Uzbekistan that people may have experienced in the last 15 or 20 years is not the one that they're going to face and encounter personally, and that they're all invited to come experience it as soon as they can. So this is an outward-facing Uzbekistan I think the world hasn't seen in a very long time. And I think we're all going to come to enjoy that an awful lot. The final thing that I would put an underlining on is when we talked about, and we did talk about security objectives with Uzbekistan, we talked about what to us is a lot more organic model. Uzbekistan has been wonderful on itself embracing its neighbor in Afghanistan. They've done a tremendous amount bilaterally of their own initiative. President Ghani has been up and had just meetings that no one would have imagined 2 years ago in Tashkent. There's a lot of follow-up going on. There's a lot of trade that's building. We commended the Uzbeks for this, and we talked about how we could go steps beyond. And we talked about how Uzbek energy helps harness Central Asian energy, and how they together can bring to Afghanistan a sort of regional identity and a regional outlet for social and economic development that frankly just hasn't had in the last 15 to 16 years. And that is itself, when you talk to Ghani, he's very much talking about how that's almost bringing a new light, he says, into his world. He realizes that he truly is politically embraced in Central Asia, that these aren't occasional press releases that come out. He said he felt personally welcome in Tashkent when he was up there in a way that he says, I could breathe again when I was up there. It's interesting to have the talks with him about this. And we encouraged more of that to go on, and President Mirziyoyev was very clear that that's his vision for how he wants the neighborhood to work. And he's put his money where his mouth is. Throughout his neighborhood, it hasn't been a declaratory policy. He's been out clearing up border issues. He's been talking about water rights and water management in a very roll-up-your-sleeves sort of way. He said, what are the problems, and let's tackle them. We encouraged him to do more, and we are putting a variety of resources at work to do that, whether it's in agricultural development, whether it's in dry land. A lot of the areas are in particularly dry land areas that are hard to turn into arable development, but we want to help work with that. On demining, on a lot of new border security areas. But these aren't, again, high-tech, great gamery sort of things. These are about human security issues. And they were all tied, first and foremost, by President Mirziyoyev to the things he's done already to completely change the narrative on human rights in his country and where he intends to take it further. And these weren't discussions where we were bargaining with the Uzbek side. These were just straight up discussions about, this is what I've already done, this is my plan, and this is where I'm going. Catch up. It was for those who have dealt with the region, it was an incredible discussion to witness. I mean, we wrote things. I've still looked at the drafts of some of our reports on this, and I'll be honest with you, sir, I never thought I would see those things in reporting tables about meetings, and it is a tribute to the vision of the president, but I think it's also a tribute to the rest of the Uzbek government that is running at full speed to keep up with where he wants to go, but he's very straightforward about it. He wants to do this because he's decided that this is what the Uzbek people demand and want, and it's the only thing they're going to accept. And we don't think we can afford not to be behind that four square. So a lot of what we did was not, again, something that fits in sort of zero-sum calculus. It was about human potential realization and about talking about human security and having models where we can continuously be in contact with each other. And the one other thing, it was a very bureaucratic thing, but it's an important thing. We talked to each other about metrics. How are we, during the course of this year and next year, going to be talking to each other so we realize how we're measuring? Are we making the progress we want? Where do we see this in 6 months? How are we going to have the meeting to follow up? If not, if we're ahead of schedule, what extra resource might we put into it? It sounds very mechanical, but to be able to be in that sort of discussion, which is a very advanced sort of bilateral, multilateral discussion, with Uzbekistan was just a real thrill, frankly, for those of us that work in this, and it certainly helps the internal state AID mechanics to be able to figure it out. So I'm grateful for that. So that's my lead-in. I look forward to the discussion, and I really look forward to hearing Ambassador Vakhabov and Paul and Navbahor give all the different perspectives. There are so many stakeholders in this wonderful relationship, and I look forward to taking it all together. Thanks.
Yeah. I'd like to take some questions now.
What questions? You know,
yeah, maybe.
Well, I can take questions now, or we can do panel, however you'd like.
I think if we have some question now, specifically on the visit, we would welcome them. Or is everybody waiting for the...
Oh, we were not ready for this.
We can do counterpoint later, too. That's fine. It's fine with me, too.
Well, then I will invite Paul and Navbahor to join us, and Scott also.
Here. Right on. Is it good?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Paul, would you like to begin?
Me?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I sort of had sort of two tasks in this, and one is to sort of talk about the region regionally, but I also wanted to just respond to some of the things that Scotty mentioned. Because I sat in the White House in 2012 and 2014, and nowhere in my mind could I have thought that in 1 year we would have both the Kazakh and the Uzbek presidents in the White House, and have generally positive visions. And so, I think the Trump administration deserves some credit for refocusing attention on Central Asia. And for Central Asia is very much keyed up with our vision for Afghanistan, our vision for Eurasia as a whole. But we heard a lot about Central Asia, not a whole lot about Russia, not a whole lot about China. And I think that's a good discussion because we're bringing back Central Asia as sort of as an actor in and of itself. And I see the U.S. doing that. And I think the visit is extremely noteworthy, and Navbahor is going to talk about sort of the opening on the domestic front. But I think we're seeing an openness to regional cooperation that I didn't expect to happen so quickly and so fast. There's still a long way to go, and there's still a lot of questions of where they go from here. But so far on the regional front, it is good. And I think the slight liberalization of Uzbekistan really gives us, the West, an opening to re-engage, an opening to continue to push both on human security and ultimately, hopefully, human rights issues. But I do think it's very smart, focusing in on social, economic issues, accountability of governments and their representatives towards the population. And I'm very pleased to hear that the U.S. Is sort of focusing in on a lot of these issues. And I don't know if anybody remembers a report a couple years ago that you and I talked about, and you grilled me on VOA. And one of the things that in the report, we called for greater U.S. engagement with Uzbekistan if Karimov's successor turned out to be more liberal. There was a lot of controversy at that time, but I think we even surprised ourselves that we've seen that. Now, last week's meeting, I mean, I would say it's very successful, but I also have to give, it's very successful for the people and very noteworthy, and everybody who looks at Central Asia noted it, but a lot of other people, particularly those on Massachusetts Avenue where there was a lot of traffic, noted the traffic. And so I think, we need to keep our expectations. Central Asia is still very important, but it is, one of many issues that the U.S. Is dealing with. But the message I heard from the various representatives of the Uzbek government and the U.S. Was that Uzbekistan was open for business. They're keen to improve their judicial sector, curb corruption, enhance rule of law, with the ultimate goal of sort of increasing investment, increasing cross-border trade. And I think this is very smart because 70% of the population is youthful, under age 30, and they need, for long-term stability, long-term security, they need sustainable employment for that. And I think Uzbekistan moving in this direction will enhance the attractiveness of the region as a whole. But I really think we need to hold Uzbekistan to its promises, because we've heard Kazakhstan make some similar promises in the past, and they make them again and again. But I think if we can hold Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and really sort of help them actually not just pledge but implement, the investor climate will actually improve. And I think that's key because here we have 70 million people in general in the region. Individual countries, a lot smaller, but as a region, as a market, if you look at that as a whole, and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are the two keys to that. One is the economic power, and the other one is the political and population center. The other thing I think we heard was that Central Asia was a key focus of Uzbek foreign policy, and I think you can see that whether that was the Samarkand conference, which we heard a lot about last week, the Afghanistan conference again, the Central Asian leaders meeting in March, a real focus on the region as opposed to just all the big players outside of the region, and I think that's good. And one of the things, and we heard about how many times Mirziyoyev went to Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, the visits with Afghanistan. Yes, we did hear about the visits to Beijing and the visits to Washington, but I think they were, they just didn't compare with the sort of tremendous flurry of diplomatic activity within the region. And a desire for dialogue to solve regional problems, and that dialogue is beginning. The problems aren't solved, but that dialogue is finally happening. I think that's good. And as Scotty mentioned, I think we are hearing pledges of greater engagement with Afghanistan. If you asked me 5 years ago what was the vision for Afghanistan, it was to seal Afghanistan off, right, prevent it from doing anything, and to use Afghanistan as a means for security assistance to the region. Now I think we heard from the Uzbek delegation talk about boosting trade, energy, infrastructure, rail lines to really kind of pull Afghanistan into the region with the ultimate goal of hopefully bringing stability to the future. And I think there's a lot of we'll see how this plays out, but I think it's a good vision. I think a lot of what we heard about last week, a lot of it was symbolism, but that symbolism is good because it marks a change. Because this is a region that really has not been integrated. This is a region that has had just debate, problems after problems. Some of the problems arose from sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the infrastructure, the focus of each individual state on developing their own national identity, defending their own sovereignty. Some rose from, I'll be honest, President Karimov. I think no one will deny that. He had a sort of cantankerous attitude to some of his neighbors, especially Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. The very harsh form of authoritarianism in the country, particularly after 2005, really led to an isolation, both a regional isolation and an international isolation. And I think that was a problem because geographically it's the heart of Central Asia. It shares borders with all countries, including Afghanistan, the most populous country. And it has a legacy from the Soviet era of strong educational institutions, strong industrial base, and to sort of have a regional, cooperation, regional, forward movement without that big engine in the middle was really hard. But I think we also have to admit that Karimov was not the only problem. I mean, the neutrality of Turkmenistan and the bizarre nature of that country, fed into this isolation and this difficulty of working regionally. We had, lots of instability in Tajikistan and in Kyrgyzstan. And Kazakhstan, I mean, it's been generally stable, the most economically successful country, but it focused using its energy wealth not on the region, but it focused in on building up this image of Nazarbayev as a global leader, the non-proliferation agenda, the UN Security Council seat. It hasn't been focusing in on the region itself. So I think this is, a lot of some of the problems. There certainly have been cross-regional projects. NDN is one of them. But a lot of these projects were very much outside coming in. And they didn't have all these big regional implications. NDN was about shipping things through the region to Afghanistan. The Belt and Road Initiative, again, it's shipping things through the region, not in the region, and building infrastructure to connect the region so much as to sort of connect China with Europe. And even some of the pipeline, the Central Asian China pipeline, it's getting stuff out of the region. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of discussion of sort of a regional approach to sort of economic development, which I think, given the sort of youthful population, is key. Now, what's changed? I mean, first of all the symbolism of so many meetings, including the countries where the Uzbek and Tajik presidents hadn't met on a bilateral level for years. I think that's very important. I think the number of times Afghanistan has leadership has been to Tashkent, I think is also important. And each is met with pledges to sort of increase cooperation, increase cross-border trade, and I think we're starting to see some of that. If you just look at the trade figures, an uptick in Tajik-Uzbek trade, tremendous uptick, I think it's 35% between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The opening of some of these borders, just this has led to more cross-border traffic, which in some places brought prices of some goods down, which is improving sort of socioeconomic conditions. All of this stuff is positive. The sort of loosening of the visa regime is also positive. The ability to sort of talk about water as Scotty said, in the past it was an automatic no. We didn't even want to discuss these issues. Now it is, we're open to discussing, we're opening to solving them, we're opening to figuring out a way that we can work on this issue that will enhance Uzbekistan's long-term strategic interest instead of just the perennial no. They are talking more about, and there's more cross-border electricity transmission, gas sales. Uzbekistan sort of pulled out of the unified power grid 9 years ago. And since then, you haven't had a whole lot of discussion. We've had, serious energy security issues for pretty much every state. And we're seeing a lot more cooperation, discussions about Kazakhstan refining products in Uzbekistan, which reduces Kazakhstan's dependence on Russia for refineries. A lot of that stuff is very helpful. And so while the story is generally very positive, I mean, I think the fact that so much of this seems to depend on President Mirziyoyev, I think is a little bit concerning, because this sort of cross-border cooperation has not yet been institutionalized. I think a lot of this exciting stuff with Uzbekistan was happening, and you saw a lot of movement last fall at the same time when you saw a closure of the Kazakh-Kyrgyz border, which was about a dispute that was largely a personal dispute between Atambayev, the former president of Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan's Nursultan Nazarbayev. I think there is a real need in the region to sort of move beyond the personalized politics and the personalized diplomacy to have more institutionally based diplomacies. And I think this is key. I mean, Kazakhstan for the last 15 years has been used to being the leader of Central Asia. Now it's going to be challenged, and how does that play out? And I think these things need to be put into sort of regularized channels, particularly because we are going to be seeing leadership changes throughout the region, probably in the next 5-10 years. Several. There's the big one we all expect, but who knows what's going to happen elsewhere. And so I think moving beyond this personalized politics, I think it's a great start. But I think we need to the region needs to move beyond that. I think Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, they have very good technocrats, both of them, very good civil servants who know how to do this type of stuff, and hopefully they will be empowered to try and move this so that you do not need presidential intervention to solve some of these issues. And
thank you so much for Navbahor. Would you like to continue?
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure and honor to speak here. We had a really nice event in September following the visit by President Mirziyoyev to New York when he came to the UNGA. And at that time, the story was, we see change in Uzbekistan. Change is in the air in Uzbekistan, and a lot has happened since then. It's been a remarkable journey for journalists like me who have covered Uzbekistan from here, Central Asia from here for a long time. We've been having so much fun covering Uzbekistan, I'll be honest. And no sleep, of course. You can't sleep because you may miss tons of stories while you're asleep in Washington. But it's been a very historic time. I would use the word historic in this sense because the online Uzbekistan is very dynamic. And that's one of the best things that I think happened to Uzbekistan for the past 2 years. Finally being able to work with the journalists back at home, having that connection, and feeling like, wow, as a journalist, I'm more connected to my audience than ever. And our audiences are not just in Uzbekistan. Our audience is the every Uzbek-speaking person in the world. But those Uzbeks are all looking at Uzbekistan and getting inspired, and the conversation is very rapidly evolving. And I could feel that when we had the delegation. We had a huge delegation from Tashkent here last week, and hanging out with dozens of Uzbek journalists who were here to cover the presidential visit, to also getting to finally sit down and talk to the Uzbek policymakers who are behind this ambitious reform agenda. The Minister of Justice, Ruslanbek Davletov, came to Voice of America to talk to us. And he gave us 1 hour, so basically we could talk about anything, on the record, off the record. And, we had Senator Safayev here, who is one of the most loyal soldiers, I would say, political soldiers in Tashkent. We had Akmal Saidov, Mr. Human Rights of Uzbekistan. That's the nickname I've given him a long time ago. The guy who has been telling the human rights story of Uzbekistan for like 2 decades. And his narrative has been changing, so this was a great opportunity for people like me to basically corner him and say, hey, how have you changed? Have you changed? Like, you must change, please, please change. So, but his response was very simple. He basically said, I am still very useful. My ideas, my proposals still sell in Tashkent, and the government has been adopting my proposals. And some of his proposals, as he narrated, are pretty remarkable. So, some people are good at, changing, right, with the times. But there are some things that I think we heard from the delegation, from very, high-level officials, that we should hold them responsible do our best to hold them responsible, because they can't just say and get away, you know. That's there. I've said it in Washington. That's our narrative, and that's where we're going. I think some of the things that, you know, we heard were remarkable and really news for Uzbekistan. Things like reform process is irreversible. You know, Uzbekistan is changing not because the world wants it to change, because people want change. And it will change because people will be behind those changes, you know. So Uzbekistan needs to evolve from what president wants to what we want and how we want, and how do we get there? Who is doing what? How much human capital do we have? You know, you can't just brag about your massive human capital. You have to really stop and focus on what kind of human capital do we really have. Because the message from the government, from president himself on a daily basis, is that we lack expertise. We need people to be able to do all these things we want. And you know, so Uzbeks can't sit there and say, you know what, we're over 33 million people, we're very capable. Well, now that you want so much international investment, the world's businesses are wondering about what you can do, like how much training, you know, do these people need. So these are like reality checks for the Uzbek people that, you know, that make them uncomfortable. And it's okay. They should feel uncomfortable, because these are really massive changes that they want. You can't just sit there and want. You have to make them happen. So for me as a journalist, I really want to get into those details. You know, we can't just say officials met, presidents met, here is the new strategic partnership. Whoa, the joint statement is just filled with all these interesting details, and that's that. You know, for me, now more than ever, I think for the Uzbek media, more than ever, and for everyone else who is watching Uzbekistan, who's covering Uzbekistan, we need to be inside. We need access to Uzbekistan. We need to really be able to get the reality, to see the reality from there. And that was one of the reasons why I myself applied for accreditation. I also wanted to check the system out. I wanted to test it, because we know that, you know, we've been constantly told that it's changing, that it's getting better, and that the system should work, and you just, you know, follow the rules and follow the instructions, and that's what I did, and I got my accreditation. So, you know, but that's another level of, you know, major responsibility on a journalist like me, because I'm also, you know, my main job is in Washington, so I can't really be, we're not opening a bureau, we're not gonna have a permanent presence in Uzbekistan, but the good news is that it is open for me and for the Voice of America, so we can go to the country, look at the bigger picture, you know, check out the borders, how are things going there with the posts and everything, be able to discuss and analyze Uzbek foreign policy from Tashkent. I want to go interview lawmakers. I want to see what's happening in the security sector, you know, which is supposed to be fundamentally reforming. I want to see what's happening in the healthcare, what's happening to the Uzbek economy. So we really want to get this big but detailed story from Uzbekistan. So that was the reason why we've been so passionate and aggressive about getting this accreditation. One of the remarkable things that we heard from the Uzbek delegation last week was that Uzbeks need a new parliament. Which is, you know, again, I would never believe if somebody said that 2 years ago or a year ago, you know, because Oli Majlis at some point had become irrelevant. And we can safely say that, you know, we knew who was making the policy in Uzbekistan, we knew who was in charge of the foreign policy, and the lawmakers essentially were just sitting there, you know, accurately speaking. Now we feel we have these empowered lawmakers, you know, deputats and senators who feel like Senate doesn't make laws in Uzbekistan, but they feel like even in their advisory positions, they can do a lot of things. So whenever I talk to a lawmaker, mostly off the record, I sense this empowerment. They want to do things. They are worried about getting re-elected because there is now politics in Uzbekistan. There is some kind of a political competition that's you know, starting to take place. Another remarkable thing that I heard again and again was that human rights situation should improve, must improve. There is no other way, and it should improve because we live there. Because it's our human rights, you know, and that discussion, the open discussion of that is also, I think, it's very interesting. And when I talk about these things, they were vibrant discussions online about these issues. You know, so there is this virtual public debate that's going on that is parallel to the news reporting that we're doing on Uzbekistan. And these things were being discussed as, President Mirziyoyev was visiting Washington. Uzbekistan wants to be a modern democratic state, earning the respect of the international community by honoring international laws and its own laws. So that is something that we should hold the Uzbeks responsible for. Again, they cannot get away just by saying these things. They have to follow up. Media freedom is crucial. I heard that again and again. And then, of course, there are challenges. So how do we mitigate the expectations of our own people? Great, the world is expecting a lot from us, but reforms should improve our economy, our healthcare system. It should improve our educational system. It should become easier for people to travel abroad, housing opportunities, or opportunities in general for the Uzbek people. Security services, now the National Security Service, this biggest machine in Uzbekistan, has turned into state security service, but that's not a reform, and that's not enough of a reform. Now, what is going to happen? President Mirziyoyev, very often he talks about the reforms that should take place in this specific service. So we will be watching that, like how will it shape? What are these reforms like? What's going to happen? How will the internal affairs change in Uzbekistan? The Justice Ministry. So you can watch our interview, and we did it in Uzbek and English with the Justice Minister Ruslan Davletov, and he fully recognized the fact that Uzbekistan is very good at producing lots of laws. Like for the past 1 year, apparently there have been like 800 laws. That's a lot of laws. Now, how do you work on them? How do you execute them? Do you have enough people to work on them? The Ministry of Justice, for the first time I learned that has about 8,000 people, staffers. Yeah, that's, so they're working around the country. And so as we're getting more insight from the government, obviously the heavier is, the responsibility on the government too. But as a journalist, I feel way more responsible than I did before, because I know more now. And as I'm getting more, getting to learn more, I'm also like connecting with my colleagues back at home, because there are a lot of journalists there who know a lot, but they haven't been able to report. So the challenge now is, how do we help each other? And by helping each other, then how do we help people to get better at knowing? Because we all know that informed public leads to an informed government. And when you cannot have, you cannot do reforms without an informed public and informed government. So if we really want to be that true ideal bridge between the public and government, no matter where we are, we have to get better at our job. So when I wake up every morning and get several messages from the Uzbek journalists asking me questions like, how do we report this? Like, can you help me to get to this person? Where we need training, what are the best ways to access training? Or can we do a story based on this? Can we interview this person? I know Uzbekistan is doing better. Because that's what I need to hear. So when Uzbek National News Agency about 10 days ago announced that they will cover the presidential trip to Washington through the Voice of America, to us, that was an unbelievable change. And I kept on asking my colleagues in Tashkent, like, are you sure? Like, have you gotten all the green lights possible? Because we don't want you to get into trouble. And they said, hey, we've already posted it. We have others too covering. We have journalists for us working for us in the special delegation, but we want to rely on that. So there is some level of comfort within the official and let's say online media in Uzbekistan. They dare to explore, they dare to come up with their own ideas, and they dare to imagine and then envision these things. So again, the challenge is, how do we work with that? The biggest thing is, it's not easy to cover change, and this is we're just getting started. So we had this very established ways of covering Uzbekistan. It's very closed. Nobody talks from the government. Yes, I've called a gazillion times. Nobody talks. So we talk to the human rights activists. We talk to whoever talks, and you somehow build a story around it. Now there are a lot of people willing to talk. And when you do a story, many people from Uzbekistan reaching out and saying that I have this to say, I I have this to say, I have this input, you have to get it. So for the Voice of Americas and the BBCs and the RFERLs of the world, there's so much work to do. And I think we also need to reconsider our own approaches and styles. So another thing that I heard from the journalists, so opening in media, they told me, these were the Uzbek journalists in Washington, they said it may seem slow, but do not underestimate the awakening in local journalism. There is so much more coverage of the economic situation inside the country, social issues. These were never covered the way. And you know, there have been some remarkable stories in Uzbek media recently. And also people are, in my own observation, people are moving from being passive followers to active followers. This is a very slow process. But now they also want to participate. So I think those are some good stories. But again, challenges are, you know, how do you go from this, president wants this is what we hear from the top leader, to do we really want this, and what can we do about this? And this may sound very simple, but that is where Uzbekistan is today.
Thank you so much, Navbahor. Let me just do some very brief comments. Many things have been said, but there are several short elements that I would like to add. The first one, I think, which is really impressive, is that there is a vision. And that I found really impressive, that this president and the team have a vision of what they want to change. They may fail in their vision, they may have to adapt their vision, they will have to face unexpected results of their change, there will be losers who will be resisting, there will be limits, but there is a vision. And that I found particularly interesting if you think about what the regime was and the way we were qualifying it. It means that autocracy can reform from the inside, but people who have been at the heart of the elites, and they can themselves measure and realize when things have to change. And so in a sense, a very positive message about how a system can reform from inside in this kind of revolution from above, with, as Paul was saying, all the limitation of a revolution from above, which is that it's from above. So if something happened to the above, you don't know what will how it will develop. But that I found really interesting, how a regime reform itself from the inside. And I'm always hesitating making that parallel because it's often interpreted, especially on the side of the post-Soviet world, as negative, but said from my side it's not. It's the parallel with perestroika and glasnost. It's when suddenly elites of the regime themselves want to make the change, a genuine change for themselves. And of course, I'm not wishing Uzbekistan to follow, of course, and it will not, because what happened to the Soviet Union after perestroika was something very specific that cannot be reproduced. But you have this kind of genuine elite transformation from the inside that I found really fascinating. Several small points that I think will be very interesting to follow in the forthcoming months. The first one, and Paul briefly mentioned that, will be the dynamic of the Kazakhstani-Uzbek couple. And that will be really fascinating to see how it will be evolved. You all know that it was quite tense and competitive in the 90s and early 2000s, mostly because of competition between the two presidents, but also because the two countries were showing different ways. And now what I found really interesting in how Uzbekistan is referring to Kazakhstan as a model, as a country to emulate, or as a country to learn from. And what I find really, that will be really interesting for those of us who are following the region, is to see what Uzbekistan will be taking from Kazakhstan and what it will not be taking. Because that will really show us what Kazakhstan did that can be emulated and what cannot be, or maybe because Uzbekistan will come up with better solution and say, well, yes to that, but no to that aspect, we will do something differently, kind of Uzbek way. And so that kind of couple dynamic will be really interesting to follow with this kind of emulation. And as Paul said, that will also force Kazakhstan to kind of rethink of itself, and not being the obvious kind of leader of the region, but having to deal with an Uzbekistan that will be kind of pushing for more emulation. So that will be really, I think, interesting to follow. Some other regional consideration will be also interesting. Water is one of them, but not in the traditional sense of managing trans-border rivers. I mean, that's a critical aspect also. But just the way Uzbekistan will be able to rethink, and that is working for Uzbekistan, but it's in fact for the whole region, their mismanagement of water. Because water in Central Asia is overused and misused. Okay, it's the region in the world that is spending the more water. So they will have to rethink all that, and that will be really fascinating to see, and that will probably contribute to a general rethinking of the water issue in the whole region. Then, of course, the relationship to Russia will be really important, and not only the bilateral relationship, but also how Tashkent is now already discussing or interacting with the Eurasian Economic Union. And you know that Russia is used to kind of threaten the non-member countries for losing the right of sending their migrants if they don't become, without visa, if they don't become member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And so really interesting to see how Tashkent is reacting and negotiating with Moscow on that aspect. Also something that is really also kind of growing trend to follow is how the Uzbek authorities are now discussing migration issues. Because for years the migration phenomena was denied and negated by the Uzbek authority. It's no more the case now, and you can see this kind of thinking that, well, it would be good for Uzbekistan not to have all its migrants to Russia, but also to find a way to diversify. And that was already the case before. There was this agreement with South Korea, for example. But now the Uzbek authorities are interested in kind of trying to find other direction for their own migrants, not to be reliant too much on Russia. It also means finding a way to integrate migrant experience. And there have been several migrant community and kind of groups in Russia who are also kind of well organized, and so that will be really fascinating to see how these Uzbek migrants and more globally Uzbek diaspora in Europe, in the US, in the other country will become a push for reform. Which kind of interaction will they be proposing? So, because we are so much used to see Uzbekistan as a close country, but now clearly the interaction with Uzbek abroad will become something that can be a very positive push. Another important element, which seems of course obvious, it's the youth and young people. The country has a huge human capital. Young people are thirsty for change, for travel, so the country really needs to find a way to create jobs. What I think really is really impressive is the current discussion about reforming education and higher education. There are several discussions now about having new international universities, I mean sub-branch of international Western universities opening in Tashkent, so something that is very positive. And I think the Westminster one is a good example of already of a successful university, international university based in Tashkent. But also what I found really interesting is the way the Uzbek authorities, and it's something that on that I think we should give credit to the previous government also, of not following the Kyrgyz and the Tajik way of having their literacy decline so heavily, and really realizing how much primary education is absolutely critical. And I think on that, I mean, Uzbekistan has been the best of the 5 countries in realizing how much you cannot lose primary education. Otherwise, why don't you need higher education if you don't have children at school able to learn the basics? So this ability of kind of keeping provincial, relatively high-level college with technical or technological now education, the need to train new generation of engineers, so all this kind of human capital aspect, which was already there, in fact, I mean, in the Karimov regime, but in a much more kind of limited way, is now able to kind of open, and I think we will see a lot of interesting initiatives going on in the region. And then my last point is about, here also that's an important critical element that we haven't been discussing so far, is the relationship to Islam. And it's not about only religious freedom and right to pray, to attend a mosque, the issue of course releasing religious prisoners. It's more globally the new strategy, and it arrived very early in the Mirziyoyev government. The will to kind of rethink the place of Islam as the component of the society and of the kind of cultural world, and how to try to integrate some kind of something related to Islam into the teaching globally, kind of reshaping the way this kind of national ideology, you formulate it as you want, it can be softer than purely ideology, but to be infused with something that is related to Islam, because why deny if it's all over the place in the society? And so that is something that arrived very early in the Mirziyoyev time that I found really interesting. And we had some surveys done a few years ago in the main Uzbek universities asking students about their relationship to Islam. And something that was really fascinating is that they were in huge majority asking for Islam to be taught at school. Not a lot of hours, but some hours. And so I found that interesting to see how now the government seems to be more ready to engage in finding a way to take something from Islam and integrate it into the national narrative, and not to push Islam as only something that is foreign, dangerous, radicalized, and so on. So all these directions are really, I think, impressive, and they are showing how much a society that for so long has been considered as closed can reform from itself and based on its own kind of genuine dynamic. So I will stop on that, and before opening the floor for questions, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Vakhabov for some comments, and we really thank you for being here. Yeah, please, that would be great.
Marlene, thank you so much for having us. It's a great honor to be here. 1 month ago, when I received confirmation on this visit by Ambassador Lawler, the head of the Department of State's protocol, I was slightly confused. I haven't known whether I should regret or be happy.
Is the mic working?
The mic. Yeah, sorry.
I haven't known whether I should regret or be happy, so later came to understanding that the events predetermined must happen as it was planned. So last week, when I've seen the high-ranking delegation at Andrews, I found that the best smell I ever found is the smell of sliding rubber of the plane taking away my delegation. After the dust settled, and having survived the wheel of party, now I can share with all of you with my own impressions and my own conclusions regarding the visit itself. Starting from yesterday, I've been questioned a lot about how the visit was perceived in Uzbekistan, about how the meetings were assessed by key members of Uzbek government. Right after a long-awaited weekend, the weekend I and my team very much deserved. So I would say that there was a quite positive and good mood among all members of our cabinet, both at the time of their arrival to DC and at the end of the visit. Everyone was happy. Everyone had a feeling that mission was accomplished. And here I must confess that at the beginning, both Scotty and Ansho were very skeptic about my plans, about key deliverables that we supposed to gain right after the visit. But I was sure, thanks to our preparations were made together with my colleagues at the embassy. And thanks to these guys, we reached our ambitious goal. We arranged these visits at high level. And now there's no doubt that this visit was historic and extremely successful for many reasons. For the first time in our history, the United States administration invited our president to pay an official visit to America. For the first time, we discussed new ideas, new approaches, new initiatives on supporting domestic reforms, on strengthening regional security. Not problems in our relations or concerns that it used to be in the past. The amount of trade and investment agreements that we've signed within the framework of this visit was about almost $5 billion. $5 billion. Probably for the first time in our history. And this figure was very important, and I would like to underscore that this figure fully corresponds to those figures that were estimated by the Department of Commerce and approved by the White House. No chasing figures. So, for the first time, I will have a lot of questions. So for the first time, we attracted as much investment under one contract as $1.3 billion. According to this agreement, American-Canadian company Sky Power decided to attract this investment in Uzbekistan in order to build solar power energy plant in Uzbekistan in several regions of our country for the first time. Another project, another agreement we've reached during this visit relates to our arrangements with Silverleaf Investment Capital from Tennessee on creating agro cluster system in Uzbek province, the place where my president was born. Very symbolic. And the aim, I'm very glad to see here our partners from Cotton Campaign who just recently come back from Tashkent, and that's why I'd like to just highlight the main essence of this project. So it aims at creating a cotton cluster system which combines the process from seeding to producing apparels in Uzbekistan, demonstrating our close cooperation with the leading American investment groups. We would like to prove, we would like to show that by the end, as it was promised, as you remember, by DPM Navbahor 2 months ago, we are planning to eliminate the risks of forced labor by the end of 2020. So we are planning to mechanize cotton picking process using American well-known machines, John Deere tractors and combines. And the total sum of investments that we are attracting from the United States is up to almost $350 million. That will be the first step. That will be the first step in order to eliminate this problem from Uzbek-American bilateral agenda. Another point, we view American investments and new technologies as means to improve our business management style and ethics, as a source of advanced accounting experience. We truly believe that there is no corruption or embezzlement in countries which possesses American technologies. Besides that, I would like to confess that we hosted these days more than 400 people coming from Tashkent. A lot.
It was huge.
For the first time in my practice, in my experience. So more than 60 Uzbek press members from both public and private media companies have covered the high-level events during the arrival of our president here in DC. So the main idea behind this was that we wanted to inform the wider audience in Uzbekistan about the real life in the United States, about its heritage, culture, economy, its domestic policy at all, its foreign policy. To that end, we wanted to get rid of any false stereotypes existed about the United States and our country. So that was the main goal. And using this opportunity, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the Department of State that kindly assisted to members of our press office who set up a great program for two of our media teams, hired professional producers for that purposes. Thank you so much, Scotty. Thank
I'm
you
just
so
pointing
much.
at Greg who did all the work.
Everyone who attends today's event. So in order to bring Uzbekistan's atmosphere to Washington, we hosted about 70 artists and chiefs at the official dinner reception held during the visit. To be honest, I was afraid that Secretary Ross, right after reading his message to the audience, would leave the party. But, and I assume thanks to hospitality expressed by our president himself, he decided to leave. And he decided to stay and enjoy it. And really enjoyed the event.
Yeah,
and using this opportunity, I would like to express my many thanks to the Department of Commerce and all those people who were engaged in arranging this historic visit, this event. Thank you so much. Thank you.
But now we have some time for some questions, so let me open the floor. I will ask you to introduce yourself and give a question or have some comments. Please. So, yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for the very fruitful discussion. It was very eye-opening about Uzbekistan's new policy, especially with new administrations in both countries and these relations. So my name is Noor Sultan. I'm a student at UC Berkeley. And I just wanted to, I don't really have a question. I wanted to make a comment more on Kazakhstan's approach to Central Asian development in this time as well. Like pointing out that, I mean, in these past 2 years, Kazakhstan has been a member of the UN Security Council, and in its membership, it also brought up 7 priorities specifically, including Central Asian stabilization, integration, further development, and even a particular focus on the strengthening of Afghanistan in this approach. And so even during the presidency of Kazakhstan of the Security Council in January, there were many meetings and briefings held with other Central Asian states before, during, after the presidency, as well as even an organized trip to Afghanistan by the Security Council, which was the first since 2010. So Kazakhstan did make sure to bring up many of the regional concerns and regional plans that it had to the rest of the world with the Security Council. So I'd just like to know your thoughts on these developments.
No, I mean, I think you are right. I mean, I think Kazakhstan has tried to focus in on this issue, and I think it is it deserves credit for that. And I think it's, the fact that we're probably seeing traction on some of these issues is probably because you have the two most important states in the region over the last couple months focusing in on it. Kazakhstan, I think, is doing it in this. Kazakhstan has given a lot of humanitarian aid, development aid, which I think is all very, very, very helpful. But I think Kazakhstan is still focusing in on this through an international lens as opposed to through a regional lens. And maybe it's the combination of the two different approaches that we've seen greater action and greater activity on the issue. But I just encourage both countries to continue working together because the Afghan problem is huge, and it's a huge security issue for the entire region. It's a traditional security, but it's also got human security elements too that need to be addressed. And I think this is a way, if there's always the potential, and is there going to be rivalry between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan? I think working together on this issue, there doesn't need to be rivalry. They can do it through their different approaches. But I think a common effort and common leadership from those countries, I think, is key to helping resolve some of the security issues there.
If I may. I would agree with a lot of what Paul's got to say. I mean, I think you're right to reflect credit on Kazakhstan and how it's been using its Security Council seat both for Central Asia and for dealing with the challenges from Uzbekistan. I mean, from Afghanistan. And behind the scenes, I mean, a lot of what you're hoping for, we're seeing between the Uzbek leaders and the Kazakhs over this issue. They did a lot of good work on the UNGA resolutions as a result. We had a C5+1 meeting right on the margins of the Security Council special session on Afghanistan, and very clear kind of tandem leadership from the Uzbek and Kazakh delegations at the highest levels was present there. We also saw in the Tashkent conference a lot of work being done between the two delegations. One thing we haven't talked a little bit about C5+1, which was very prominent and also in our private discussions here last week. And I think more than anything, the region deserves credit. They had basically a C5 summit, I would say with an asterisk, because the Turkmen sent the Speaker of basically the Speaker of Parliament, but for those people who you follow Turkmenistan, that's basically, you're doing really well there. And I think even the Turkmen are probably wondering about, maybe next time we'll do it. And there will be a next time. That's the next thing. There is going to be another C5 summit. And I think the Kazakhs deserve credit for kind of jump-starting it, and the thought had been out there in the region. And I think there was some intentional work there because the next time around, I understand it's going to be in Tashkent. So, I mean, I think I agree with you for it to really take off, be institutionalized, deep-rooted. It'll take those two great societies working in tandem, but I see those pistons working together, and I hope to see a lot more of it. And I feel fairly confident we will see that. You're right, though. There are challenges that the region's going to face, and their chances are a lot better together than apart. And I see promise there, but it doesn't mean that we have to lose focus. We really have to. We, the U.S., I know a lot of the international community want to very much get behind that and stay behind that too. But I do appreciate, because it does take focus on at the world stage and the global stage. And again, another thing, we're here talking about the Washington visit of President Mirziyoyev, but he had a really impressive debut up at UNGA last fall too. He took the town by storm, and it was a really impressive performance. And Uzbekistan's followed up what it said it was going to do there. They weren't empty promises. They talked about what they were going to do in the conferences, how they were going to engage Afghanistan. They followed right through. So more of the same. We just look forward to future chapters in the story. And keep watching.
Yeah.
With Navbahor's help.
Yeah. Can I just? I think this is all good. I mean, Kazakhstan is very active internationally. It's probably the most active international player, among the Central Asian countries. But I also see a lot of like prestige-seeking efforts. You can't really. And I've covered Kazakhstan. I've covered Kazakh, embassy here, Kazakh-U.S. relations, and I feel this hunger for prestige. Sometimes you just want to tell them, it's great that you can't possibly be a member of every international, body in the world, but also do not forget your international responsibilities. And that's also something that I don't think Uzbeks want Uzbekistan to also go take that path. The social-political situation in Kazakhstan, I'm sorry, it's been deteriorating, especially when it comes to media freedom. A lot of journalists have been, prosecuted. They operate under a lot of pressure. So it's great that Kazakhstan is doing all these things, up on the international arena. But sometimes it helps to also look deep inside and see what we're actually doing to boast about. Uzbekistan now wants to be the member of the International Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council. And my biggest question is why? What are you going to get from it? That's where Saudi Arabia's of the world, Ethiopia's, and all the big, horrible human rights violators sit. So do you really want to be in that circle? But why? And the answer so far that we have gotten is that maybe it will help us improve our human rights situation. Great. Let's, then try. But I think there is a lot of emphasis on what we're doing internationally without discussing what's really happening inside our own societies.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think you're right, and I think there are people in Kazakhstan, they might not be the people making all the decisions, but there are people in Kazakhstan who recognize that and recognize that as Kazakhstan looks for this global vision, there's a lot it needs to do internally to deal with socioeconomic issues to make a more stable society. And I think there's growing realization in Kazakhstan for that as well.
Okay. Let's collect several questions. So to the
Bill Deal, I hate to say this, but President Emeritus of the U.S. Kazakhstan. Given the nature of the political economies in Central Asia, I would like to know if during this visit there was any discussion of privatization of state enterprises or readiness to engage in joint ventures. Some of the things that the ambassador mentioned, for example, would those packaged as joint ventures with state enterprises, or were they freestanding for John Deere, for example, et cetera? I'm just wondering, what is the readiness of this government to begin addressing the structural reforms that come with looking at the role of state enterprises in the economies?
Let's collect several questions.
Nick Schenken from Freedom House for Nations in Transit. And I mean this question in a constructive sense. A word or a phrase and a concept I haven't heard a lot in this discussion is political pluralism. When does political pluralism, political competition enter into the reform agenda? How does it enter into the reform agenda?
Okay.
And there was a third question here. Yeah.
Sofia Marwa, Oxford Brookes University. And my question would relate to Abir regime, whether or not there were any discussion with relation to that, because human development, migration barriers, would there be any expectation of change in that regard? Thank you.
Who want to begin privatization of pluralism?
Lisa Curtis, who is the President Trump's advisor on deputy assistant on South and Central Asia, told us, she gave us an interview 2 days ago, and she basically said that the economic reforms in Uzbekistan were very much discussed during the talks, and I'm sure the Uzbek diplomats can add to that. And basically the discussions focused on creating an open, fair field for the businesses, to come in and work. So privatization, tax regime, anything that really provides more freedom economically and business-wise. Those things were very much discussed. I mean, we don't know a lot of the details, but judging on the based on the fact how much investment was made or promise to invest was made here, nearly $5 billion, and Uzbekistan is promising to reform itself economically. So big economic reforms. Let's see where they take us. But That's all we can say from what happened here in Washington. But back at home, there's a lot of discussion of economic reforms, starting from intellectual rights to all the way to owning small businesses. Reforming the tax code is also a big discussion back at home. The good news is that these are all being discussed. There is a lot of material to read in Uzbek. There is more quality content in Uzbek to actually understand what's happening in the Uzbek economy. A lot of people are obviously watching the currency reform, which is also was a big move for Uzbekistan. Do you want to? Can I answer the other?
Yeah. Sure, sure.
So political pluralism, that conversation has not started yet. So, I mean, we haven't gotten there. Uzbeks, the government hasn't really started that conversation yet. We have heard some remarks from the Uzbek leaders, including President Mirziyoyev himself, and also from the new head of the State Security Service, Ikhtiyar Abdullayev, who talked a little bit about it. But, Uzbeks at some point have to make peace with their past, with their past 30 years. Like, you can't really, jump over, and then say, okay, let's just start an open, clean page, and let's not really talk about what happened. We have to discuss what happened during President Islam Karimov. All the goods and all the bad things that took place, because society continued to evolve. They experienced things, they learned things. That's when Uzbekistan became a part of the international system. So we have to talk about that. So that conversation then should include so-called Uzbek opposition, which is not based inside Uzbekistan. Are they relevant? Are they making themselves relevant? Do they exist? Do they have any ideas? Do they have a platform? What should happen to the former political prisoners who are out now? They came out now, so what happens now? The reconciliation process, should start at some point. And let's see if new human rights organizations will get registered. Let's see if there will be some space for new political groups to register. We haven't. One thing that we heard from Ikhtiyar Abdullayev, the new head of the State Security Service, he said that political opposition, if this means terrorism and extremism, is a threat. So now we have to go back and check what that means, legally speaking. Who are terrorists in the eyes of the Uzbek government? And who are extremists in the eyes of the Uzbek government? Uzbekistan came out of a system where they had no political or religious prisoners. Now we recognize that they existed. So I think it's going to be evolving. Exit visa, the government has promised some big changes. At some point, we hope that they will no longer be exit visa. There are some. I think there's a huge project in the works to change the passport policy in general. So will Uzbekistan have internal IDs and then a passport to be able to travel abroad, or will they introduce another kind of a passport? We're yet to see, but it's been discussed. So the government has issued several reports, official reports, explaining where things are going. And about a year ago, President Mirziyoyev, if I'm not mistaken, ordered to study this. Like, he wanted a full report about what could be done, how could we fix this. So it's one of the priority issues, by the way.
You've spoken about it several times in the last 2 or 3 minutes.
Would you like, on this question?
If you can go, I think you kind of answered the questions.
Sure. First, on economic reform, privatization, so forth like that, it was certainly a theme that came up in both in the cabinet level interactions that took place in a lot of cabinet minister to cabinet minister discussions, and also in the highest level meetings as well, and also briefly with the secretary when he saw President Mirziyoyev and Senator Safoyev, Foreign Minister Imamova, and a few others. There are several ways that I think we're trying to I've talked a lot about, or tried to talk about how we're trying to concretely follow up on some of these things. We have already spent a lot more money in judicial training and rule of law technical assistance in the last year compared to, say, the prior 7 or 8 years, and we're pushing even more money at it. And there are some very, very eager partners and on the Uzbek side, and some very fast deepening partnerships. We're working with training judges. I think another aspect that I haven't heard so much about, but is going on very intensively, that deserves credit, again reflects credit on the government, is the hunger for and the rapid moving towards judicial autonomy and actually training a public defender corps. We've got several different NGOs that we're bringing in both regionally to do work and also setting up shop in Uzbekistan now to work very much on judicial training. A lot of what you would want out of a properly executed privatization program still needs to have a rule of law framework within which it would be implemented. We find what the Uzbeks are doing right now is some very careful planning. It's the same thing they did with the currency reform. It didn't just come out of nowhere. They assembled the right, if you will, human capital. They took a lot of coaching from World Bank and IMF and got some really good advice. They took the right steps with reorganizing the central bank to try and make sure they understood what running a free-floating currency would mean. And I'll knock on wood. I don't want to jinx you. You're doing fine, and it's not a small thing to do. And I think, and we're not trying to encourage. And I think I dare say, if I could be so bold as to speak for some other Western partners that are really trying to be helpful here. It's not important to do this at the fastest possible pace. It's important to do it at a responsive, responsible pace, and to make sure you understand the assets you have, and like I said, the framework you're going to have it in, understanding where the laws help, where alternative dispute resolution mechanisms are important, understanding how the international rule of law works in the capital markets. We're finding a very systematic approach to work. Sometimes we're helping, sometimes they're going to others. I mean, there are multiple models to follow, but so far I'm finding a very systematic approach. I'm very impressed for a country that's seemed semi-closed for so long at the depth of human talent and the people that are coming to the surface that maybe we didn't always see before, that are really very able, and they're better networked than maybe you might have first thought, and they ask really good questions, and they know how to ask for follow-up answers, and it's really been heartening to see it happen. I don't want to oversell it either. It's a complex transition process to make, but I don't, and the Uzbeks are making Uzbek decisions, and they should. I think we in the outside world have to be a little humble to say we don't always know the perfect answer, and the best models are going to be the ones that Uzbeks themselves consider and come to rally behind. But they're doing that on the privatization and the private capital market issues, I think, at a pretty reasonable pace right now. On some of the other questions about pluralism and so forth, I would urge you to reflect on the amount of time that President Mirziyoyev and many of his delegation members took to go to the Hill and to see senators and congresspeople and staffers, and to carve out a very big part of their time in Washington to go spend it on the Hill, and when they could have been doing more executive. They did plenty of executive branch meetings, but they really went and they asked questions on the Hill about, how do you do this? How are bills formed? How does testimony work? How do reports get written? It was a lot of very thorough, again, systematic. It was an educational set. There was a lot of gripping and grinning, getting to know each other, and that those relationships, I think, are going to be very important. But there was a lot of real, sincere interest from the president and all of his senior cabinet about how does this work between executive and legislative, and some of them talking to Orrin Hatch, and how does it work with the judiciary, and where are the lines, and why are the lines where they are, and how do you day-to-day make that work, how do your staffs. It was really impressive thing to watch unfolding. And we've again, I'm kind of patting ourselves on the back, but we're trying to put more money in with some really wonderful NGO partners we have here to try and bring more delegations from Tashkent to see both members. Some members are being very, very generous with their time. They're interested, just same thing with the Kazakhs. Most importantly, they want to train staffers. How you make information flow within a legislative activity. How does it get consumed? How does it get used? What's a committee staff do versus personal staff? and we're trying to put as much money into that as can be absorbed in a reasonable fashion. But something different's going on. I mean, others can evaluate pace and all of that sort of stuff, but there's a tremendous amount of education and really systematic follow-up going on, and it's been going on for 7 or 8 months now, and we're happy to be part of continuing it.
If I can just add on the the democratization issue, I think it's very important to check if the reforms that are announced are done in reality on the ground, and where they are not, to say, well, you said that will be done, we would enjoy to see them done, but arriving with an agenda that is not the agenda coming from the Uzbek government seems to me kind of counterproductive in the current context, both for Uzbekistan and for the region. First, there is a lot of kind of grassroots initiative. There is a lot of way of doing politics without having political party and pluralism in a legal sense. And in a sense, you want this grassroots activism to raise before having the kind of legal aspect being brought. And I think the general context is such that politicizing politics in Uzbekistan, or geopoliticizing the reforms by kind of being too pushy on what we would consider as the Western definition, will not help. And I think there is the government has been showing enough, and maybe there will be a time that will be said it's not enough and so on. But for the moment, the reforms coming from Uzbekistan seems to me enough in themselves for not them getting this kind of geopolitization of pressure on kind of political parties and democratization that would go against, I think, the reform, because there will be people unhappy when there are another in Uzbekistan. There will be losers of this change, and you don't want to kind of contribute to kind of accentuate tension and kind of geopoliticize these tensions. So that's we'll be very short. 2 last questions here, and then Mohammed. Yeah.
My name is Kirill Bonchenko. I'm the Cotton Campaign Coordinator. We are an international multi-stakeholder group working to stop forced labor and child labor in cotton production, and we just returned from Uzbekistan. So thank you, Ambassador Vakhabov, and thank you for the opportunity to go. We've been working on Uzbekistan for over 11 years, but now we had an opportunity to go openly at the official invitation and engage with the government and with different state agencies, but also with activists who are based in Uzbekistan. And I just wanted to ask a question, but also reflect to what Navbahor you said about the past and how to make peace with the past. This is more a question on transitional justice, if you will, but there are still some activists who have pending charges. And now the president, the way he's talking about forced labor and prevention of forced labor in Uzbekistan, and they were speaking in the same fashion in the past, but got persecuted for that. And some of their criminal record is still there, not expunged. There are some excellent Uzbeks who are living abroad, would like to come back, they live in exile. So I wonder if this discussion is happening on making peace with the past, if maybe you can encourage this discussion. Navbahor, now you are a accredited journalist also in Uzbekistan. So if you can comment on this, and thank you again for the opportunity to visit Uzbekistan.
My name is Mohammed Tahir. I'm media manager at the Radio Free or Radio Liberty. I want to expand both Nate and Kirill's question on whether the discussion on some of the pluralism that we see fits into our needs is going on or not, like what I'm talking about is media freedom, also ability of foreign media representative going back to Uzbekistan and establish their bases there and work, do a routine job. We are excited about Navbahor, but was there, maybe Scotty, to you, was there any discussion that the Uzbek side pledged that they are ready to extend this invitation to other media outlets, to any legit media organization who wants to have a base in Uzbekistan? And is there also any mechanism on your end to follow up if there was any village?
There was, I mean, we, at the time that the discussions were being put together and the joint statement and so forth, the only active request we really had was from VOA, so we dealt with that. I mean, there was, I'd say there are broader undertakings about a broad range of human rights activities within which that could fall. You know, the scope for follow-up action is certainly there, but the only specific one that we dealt with during the time of the visit was for Voice of America, I guess, because there was an active request. It wasn't an exclusive step. It was just that's the specific one we had. And I would also point back in very great credit again to Ambassador Vakhabov and his team putting together a White House meeting. Maybe Paul could talk about it. In 29 days was, I want this on the record, I think a world record. These were first steps. I don't think they were exclusive of other follow-on steps, so we didn't get specifically into and this and this and that one and that one. So, but there was very much the spirit of all the discussions, and very much at the highest level was about looking to be responsive in governance to those who were being governed and meeting their expectations. And these were, the whole table was sitting and listening to President Mirziyoyev explain his philosophy and you said a vision. It was that was the spirit of what was going on, and it was remarkable and commendable, and I think that's the most I could say at the moment. But again, there's nothing exclusive about that, so I look forward to further discussions of that. Thanks.
Navbahor, would you like to say very briefly something on the kind of memory?
There is a lot of discussion about what you just asked. Online Uzbekistan, again, both inside the country, outside of the country, heated debates about who wants to come back and why. You know, Uzbekistan, there used to be a virtual Uzbekistan and real Uzbekistan, and virtual Uzbekistan included a lot of orbits, different orbits. There were political activists, cultural activists, you know, refugees, political refugees and other green card holders. I mean, all around the world you have Russian Uzbeks, European Uzbeks, American Uzbeks. Now there is this move to connect with each other. So I would say that Uzbeks outside of Uzbekistan are trying to connect with each other, engage each other, and then we're also trying to engage Uzbeks inside Uzbekistan, and Uzbeks outside of Uzbekistan and the region are also trying to connect. So there is a lot of that engagement going on, and it's a very complex, incredible process that needs to be covered, that needs to be analyzed. And so there have been a lot of members of the so-called Uzbek opposition writing to President Mirziyoyev, asking him to let them come back, and none of them really have gotten any response. We haven't really heard anything from the government on that. Again, maybe they've been responses, maybe we don't know. There have been some cases when people returned and they were arrested, and some cases were opened, and then later on they were canceled, they were closed. I mean, all kinds of things are happening. It's really hard to keep up with them, but in general, a lot of Uzbeks want to return, and they want to help, they want to contribute, and they're openly discussing this and challenging others too.
Well, on that positive note, it's time for us to conclude. We'd like to thank you for being here today, and please join me in thanking our speaker and Mr. Ambassador for joining us today.
Thanks for putting it all together.